A black student is humiliated and expelled from her school by a principal who believes he can act with impunity. But he has no idea her father is the mayor of the city. The sun streamed through the classroom windows, casting warm rectangles over the neatly arranged desks as the teacher explained a formula on the board. The student's eyes wandered distractedly over her open notebook, trying to ignore the whispered remarks of classmates about her braided hair and her skin, always the target of veiled comments. The uncomfortable calm was shattered by the dry sound of the door opening and the principal appearing in the doorway with a stern expression, calling her name in a cold, authoritative tone. She looked up, surprised and embarrassed, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on her, mixing curiosity and malice. She stood up slowly, trying to maintain her dignity even as her heart raced, adjusting her backpack on her shoulders. As she passed through the door, the teacher looked away, as if to avoid any involvement, letting the silence become complicit in what was happening. In the hallway, the muffled sound of classroom chatter faded behind her, replaced by an empty echo that amplified her footsteps. She felt alone, almost small before the principal, who walked ahead without saying a word. The rigidity of his shoulders was a warning. Nothing she could say would change what was about to happen. They stopped in front of the administrative office, whose pale walls seemed more threatening than welcoming. The principal turned abruptly, his eyes scanning her like something inconvenient, laden with silent judgment. He gestured sharply at the chair in front of his desk, making it clear she had no choice but to sit and listen to the verdict he had already decided. His voice was slow and cold, choosing words that sounded polite but dripped with contempt, accusing her of inappropriate behavior and chronic disrespect without citing a single concrete example. Each phrase was like a thin blade, cutting away her reputation in front of another staff member who silently took notes, making the humiliation even crueler. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned, but she bit her lips to stop any tear from betraying her pain. The humiliation was not just in the content of the accusations, but in the public, impersonal ritual with which they were hurled at her, giving her no chance to defend herself. When he finally fell silent, he solemnly declared she was officially suspended and had to leave the school until further notice. She stood with restrained movements, holding back tears with all her strength, but the feeling of being stripped of all dignity already burned on her skin. She left the administrative office with heavy steps, the suspension notice crumpled in her sweaty hand. The hallway was almost empty, but there were teachers who pretended not to see her, slipping into other rooms or pretending to correct papers, all accomplices in a silence that weighed more than shouting. Each step toward the exit seemed to increase the weight on her back, as if she carried the shame he had decided to impose on her. As she crossed the main hall, she felt curious glances from students whispering among themselves, unable to hide the cruel pleasure of witnessing someone's fall. The security guard at the gate maintained a neutral expression, opening the iron gate without a word, as if she were a problem to be discreetly removed. The cold wind hit her as she stepped onto the street, rattling the school uniform that now seemed ridiculous, a costume of defeat. The city looked indifferent to the sight of a teenage girl alone on the curb, trying to decide whether to walk or run home. The humiliation burned like a fever, and anger and fear mixed in uncontrollable waves. When she finally decided to walk, her steps were mechanical, trying to hold back the sob that threatened to explode with every short breath. She got home too drained to knock, pushing the door slowly and being swallowed by a dark, familiar hallway. Her father was sitting in the living room armchair, still in his suit, reviewing reports, his brow furrowed in worry, but when he saw her enter, he dropped the papers at once. The silence between them was not merely the absence of words, but a heavy, thorny territory full of unspoken questions and answers. She stopped in the middle of the room, trembling, eyes swollen from holding back tears, and dropped the crumpled notice on the floor. The father looked at the paper, and then at her, taking a deep breath as if he needed to hold back a storm. The air felt dense, hard to move through, as if the shame were not just hers but the entire family's, contaminating the walls and furniture. Without saying anything, he stood slowly, crossed the room, and wrapped her in a hard, restrained hug, his heavy hand on her back as if he could shield her from everything. Even so, she remained tense and cold in his arms, feeling anger coil around her heart like a snake, promising herself she would never bow her head like that again. The house felt darker than ever that night, with the lights on but unable to warm the heavy atmosphere that hung over everyone. The father, still in his suit, sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped, staring at the floor as if it held the answers he needed. She curled up in an armchair, kept her arms crossed and eyes fixed on a distant point, her face marked by dried tears. The silence between them wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a minefield of hurt and shame they both tried to cross without setting anything off. He searched for words that wouldn't sound condescending or empty, while she refused to open up, feeling that any explanation would be useless in erasing the humiliation. Each attempt he made to ask or console only reignited her memory of the hallway, the administrative office, the complicit stares. Finally, the father let out a deep, exhausted sigh, leaning back as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. The distant noise of traffic filtered in through the window, reminding them the city moved on, indifferent to what they had lived. But the pain was theirs alone, raw and throbbing, turning what used to be a welcoming home into a silent arena of resentment and shame. Later that night, the mother sat beside her daughter on the bed, the bedside lamp casting a warm yellow glow over the rumpled sheets. She gently ran her fingers through the girl's braided hair, trying to offer tenderness where words failed. The room was full of childhood memories, stored toys, smiling photos, all of them seeming to mock the present sadness. The mother spoke softly, her voice cracking, recalling stories of when she herself had attended schools where she was always the different one, enduring veiled jokes and suspicious looks. She told these not to comfort, but to show that the wound was old, inherited, part of a cruel legacy that stubbornly refused to die. Her breathing sometimes faltered, betraying the anger and helplessness she tried to hide. The daughter listened in silence, holding back tears as if refusing to cry was her last act of resistance. Her mother's touch on her shoulders was the only anchor keeping her in the present, preventing her from drowning in pure hatred. Even so, when the mother finally stood to turn off the light, the room felt darker than ever, as if hope itself had left with her. In the living room, the father stayed awake, the lamp illuminating a pile of City Hall reports scattered over the table. His eyes scanned spreadsheets and project proposals without really seeing them, the numbers turning into meaningless smudges. His mind replayed only the image of his daughter being expelled, her face hardened to avoid crying, humiliation spilling out in silence. He got up and walked to the window, staring at the lights of the city he governed, feeling a suffocating tightness in his chest. That city was his, at least on paper, but felt more like an enemy than a home. The school he'd helped finance, the principal he had trusted, the neighbors who feigned civility, they were all complicit in a quiet violence that now stood unmasked. Returning to the table, he took a deep breath and stacked the reports, his fingers trembling with contained rage. He wasn't just the mayor of numbers or votes, but of lives, including his daughters, now wounded in an irreversible way. The idea of taking action slowly formed in his mind, a grim determination replacing the shame with a silent promise of justice. The heavy night dragged on, and he finally turned off the living room light, but found no rest as he went upstairs. He stopped in front of his daughter's closed door, resting his forehead against the cold wood, feeling his pulse race. He imagined her stifled crying on the other side, the unanswered questions, the trauma no conversation would untangle anytime soon. In the dark hallway, he allowed himself one moment of weakness, his shoulders slumping under the weight of failure as both a father and a mayor. But the collapse was brief. Soon his fists clenched, his breathing steadied, and his gaze grew firm, almost cruel. There would be no easy forgiveness for those who had humiliated his daughter and exposed the moral failures of an entire town. Without saying a word to anyone, he returned to his room and sat at his desk, opening a notebook where he began to write down names, dates, strategies. Rage turned into a plan, despair into action, because the next day, he would no longer be just the wounded father. He would be the mayor who declared war on the silence and racism that dared to touch his family. The silence of the night was swept away at dawn by a digital murmur that couldn't be contained. The first posts appeared in parent and teacher groups, conflicting versions of the student's expulsion spreading quickly. Some accounts, full of euphemisms, spoke of disciplinary issues, while others openly called it racism, sparking heated, inflamed debates. The city's social media became a battleground where longtime neighbors traded barbs and revealed prejudices once masked by politeness. Photos of the girl, leaked without permission, circulated along with cruel comments that belittled her pain or blamed her for provoking the situation. But messages of solidarity also appeared, voices demanding answers and justice, feeding a polarization no one could ignore anymore. Meanwhile, the family watched it all in silence, each phone notification burning like salt in an open wound. The father, jaw clenched, analyzed the posts, realizing the scale of the task ahead. He didn't just have to confront one principal, but an entire culture that felt entitled to judge, silence, and punish anyone daring to exist outside the expected norm. The next morning, small groups of students gathered in the school courtyard, holding hastily painted protest signs. Images of black and white teenagers standing side by side gained traction quickly, shared on local news profiles. Some teachers watched with crossed arms, worried about their reputations, while the principal observed from second-floor window, eyes narrowed in irritation. The school tried to contain the protest with formal warnings, threatening suspensions for those who participated. They called parents, notified school authorities, trying to restore an appearance of strict discipline. But the mood had already shifted. Whispers turned into organized murmurs, knowing looks passed among students who once feigned indifference, and the hallway felt more alive, more aware. At the same time, the community outside the school walls was divided. Some families declared unwavering support for the principal, insisting that discipline had to be maintained, while others demanded his immediate resignation. His name was becoming synonymous with shame for some and with unfairly attacked authority for others, and the girl's father watched everything carefully, preparing each move with calculated precision. The first TV vans arrived discreetly, with reporters clutching microphones bearing the local channel's logo. They interviewed parents outside the school, capturing contradictory reactions that were edited into dramatic cuts for the evening news. A spectacle took shape, with cameras focusing on crying students, outraged parents, and signs denouncing institutional racism. The principal agreed to an interview in the lobby, his eyes hard behind his glasses, his voice trained to sound offended, yet reasonable. He spoke of unacceptable conduct, maintaining order, and portrayed himself as the victim of a defamatory attack aiming to destroy his spotless career. His carefully chosen words, full of pedagogical jargon, served as a wall protecting prejudice disguised as concern. But the live broadcast also showed the faces of black parents crying, holding their tense children's hands, saying they no longer felt safe at that school. In an unexpected moment, the reporter highlighted the racial disparity among the teaching staff and in past suspensions, casting an uncomfortable light on what had once been dismissed as rumor. The city could no longer pretend it didn't know. That night, the atmosphere at home was even heavier, as if the walls had absorbed every shout and accusation exchanged outside. Messages on their phones wouldn't stop arriving. Some were veiled threats, others were emotional words of support from people finally finding the courage to take stand. The father read each one with cold focus, mentally cataloging allies and enemies. The daughter locked herself in her room, the glow of the phone screen illuminating her pale face as she scrolled through social media, reading cruel comments mocking her hair, her skin, her disrespect. Even the supportive messages felt cold, distant, unable to erase the shame of being turned into a public symbol against her will. The wounded pride throbbed like an open bruise. The mother tried to keep the house in order, picking up cups and plates left around, but her eyes were red, her hands trembling. At the center of it all, the father rose slowly from his chair and turned off the lamp. Before heading upstairs, he paused for a moment, staring at the dark reflection in the window and taking a deep breath, because he knew the next day there would be no more room for silence or diplomacy. He had seen enough. The day began with a solemn air that hung heavily over the city, spreading through the streets like a warning that nothing would be the same. The mayor prepared meticulously, putting on his dark suit with deliberate gestures, his mind filled with a single, unwavering purpose. He descended the stairs with firm steps, leaving behind a home that no longer felt like a refuge, but the epicenter of an exposed wound. In the central square, a crowd slowly gathered, drawn by persistent rumors and formal invitations. Reporters arrived with their cameras and microphones, while ordinary citizens clustered together, seeking answers or wanting to witness a reckoning. A modest stage had been set up, its simplicity in stark contrast to the almost historic weight of what was about to happen. When the mayor stepped onto the platform, his face was not only that of a political leader, but of a man bearing the intimate pain of a father betrayed by the very structure he had vowed to defend. The silence that settled around him seemed to acknowledge the gravity of the moment, a harbinger of truths that could no longer be denied or swept under the rug. Among the crowd, the principal stood out for his rigid, defensive posture, arms crossed tightly over his chest in a futile attempt to look secure. Sweat stained his shirt discreetly, betraying the nervousness he tried to hide behind a carefully controlled expression. His closest supporters whispered strategies, planning responses and justifications for when they would be confronted. As the event took shape, he moved with restrained gestures, as if every motion needed rehearsal to avoid betraying the fear pounding beneath the surface. His hardened expression sought to maintain authority, but small failures in posture and breathing betrayed the anxiety seeping through like cracks in an old wall. The atmosphere around him grew denser, saturated with critical stares and cameras that forgave no tremor or evasive movement. Even his most loyal allies began to fall silent, realizing their initial confidence was dissolving in the cold morning air. The facade of respect and leadership he had cultivated over the years seemed to crumble with every passing second. The tone of the square shifted when groups of students approached the front of the stage, moved by a newly discovered courage that made their hands tremble. Their faces carried a mix of fear and determination as they hesitantly stepped into view. They recounted past experiences with steady gazes, exposing episodes of subtle humiliation, selective punishments, and looks that never really hid their contempt. These testimonies spread like cracks across a once smooth surface, transforming isolated indignation into an uncomfortable chorus for those who once pretended not to see. Parents who had arrived feeling confident began to look away. Teachers clenched their hands, feeling the weight of past omissions. The crowd wavered between outrage and embarrassment, realizing the problem wasn't an isolated incident, but a systemic issue. The presence of these students completely changed the dynamic of the event, stripping the principal of any advantage he thought he had. It became impossible to argue against the collective experiences which, though distinct, form a recognizable and shameful pattern. Expressions in the audience shifted from skepticism to a quiet discomfort, as if the entire city was being forced to look into a cruel mirror. When the crowd finally settled into an almost reverent hush, the figure of the girl slowly emerged in front of the stage, breaking through the protective circle of adults around her. Her hesitant steps didn't diminish the moment's intensity. If anything, her visible vulnerability was a living accusation of the violence she had endured. The environment transformed into a dense silence, charged with an electric tension that seemed to hold everyone's breath. She stood rigidly, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowded square. Her shoulders trembled slightly, but she remained firm, radiating a restrained strength that contrasted with her youth. The cold wind rustled her braids, framing a face hardened by shame and the urgent need not to give in to tears. The audience watched without blinking, unable to interrupt with applause or murmurs, absorbing the full weight of that silent testimony. Even the principal, once proud and defiant, could no longer maintain a confident expression, his eyes downcast, fists clenched in contained defeat. The mayor watched his daughter, heart heavy, knowing that in her stood not only an unjustly treated child, but the cruel reflection of an entire society in need of change. The square remained enveloped in a heavy silence after the girl's testimony, as if every person present had been forced to reconsider their own beliefs. The mayor stood tall, his face marked by controlled pain, allowing the silence to speak for long seconds before taking action. His posture carried symbolic weight, representing not just the political figure, but the wounded father who refused to accept his daughter being treated as disposable. He stepped forward on the makeshift platform, his grave expression reflecting the burden of leading a city forced to confront its own ugliness. His gaze swept over the crowd, searching for familiar faces, friends, voters, who now looked away when faced with the truth laid bare before them. The weight of cameras, journalists, and social media ensured that nothing could be hidden or silenced anymore. Without ever raising his solemn tone, he began to expose the structural failures that had allowed what had happened to his daughter, denouncing the deep-rooted prejudice woven into the school's halls. The people watched frozen, unable to move or speak, feeling their embarrassment turned indignation. It was an act of courage and public condemnation that left no room for excuses or justifications. The atmosphere grew even heavier when city staff handed out piles of carefully prepared documents. Papers trembled in the hands of school board members and reporters, revealing uncomfortable details that had previously been buried in drawers and forgotten files. There were records of formal complaints, reports of incidents that had been shelved, and evidence of disproportionately harsh punishments against black students. Each page examined in public corroded the carefully maintained image of impartial authority that the principal had so zealously cultivated over the years. The crowd followed the unfolding revelations with wide eyes, as if watching a collapse in real time. Teachers whispered among themselves, surprised to find that so many of the stories whispered in the halls were documented, waiting only for someone brave enough to reveal them. The principal, once so self-assured, kept his arms crossed with excessive force, his fingers digging into his own flesh in a useless attempt to stop their trembling. His face grew paler with every piece of evidence displayed, his eyebrows arched in a vain effort to deny the undeniable. Even his most loyal supporters began to slowly back away, embarrassment clear on their faces. As the square filled with voices that had once been silenced, the principal felt increasingly isolated, as if an abyss were opening beneath his feet. Where once there had been respectful greetings and unwavering support, there were now cold, judging stares fueled by a long-suppressed anger. The image of moral leadership and strict discipline evaporated under the harsh light of public exposure. Reporters crowded closer, cameras trained on his tense face, capturing every micro-expression of fear he could no longer hide. The questions didn't even need to be asked out loud. The collective silence and suffocating expectation were enough to draw out answers in disordered gestures. It was a symbolic lynching, unstoppable, that required no physical violence to impose a definitive social punishment. The school board, pressured by public opinion and the undeniable evidence, met hastily in a makeshift corner, their faces tense. When they finally stood to announce their decision, there was no suspense left. His summary dismissal was just the formal acknowledgement of something that had already become inevitable. The principal didn't protest, didn't meet anyone's gaze as he left. He simply dragged his feet away, vanishing into a crowd that parted in awkward silence. With the principal's departure, the square breathed a restrained sigh of relief, but the mood was not one of noisy celebration. People exchanged glances marked by shame and reflection, aware that his humiliation didn't erase the damage done. The mayor remained firm on the makeshift stage, eyes fixed on an undefined point, as if carrying the weight of having exposed not just one man, but an entire structure of inequality. His daughter, standing in front of the platform, held her books against her chest like a shield, shoulders tense, chin raised despite her wet eyes. She felt the weight of hundreds of stares on her, divided between guilt, curiosity, and belated respect. Though justice had been served undeniably, there was no real triumph in becoming the public face of such an old wound. The crowd began to disperse in slow, silent steps, leaving behind fallen banners, forgotten signs, and the echo of an event that would forever change the collective memory of the city. The mayor stepped down from a stage without any visible relief, stopping beside his daughter to rest a careful hand on her shoulder. They both knew that despite the victory, nothing would return them to the time before the humiliation, and that the real fight was only just beginning. Days later, City Hall organized a press conference in one of its largest rooms, with walls lined in dark wood panels and a cold, austere lighting that made the atmosphere somber. Local journalists crowded into rows of chairs, balancing notepads and recorders as camera flashes blinked intermittently. Expectation hung in the air like a heavy veil, thick with unanswered questions and fears about the future. The mayor entered with measured steps, his face marked by the exhaustion of sleepless nights and weighty decisions. His eyes scanned the room without seeking approval, conveying a weariness that was more moral than physical. He stood at the podium without pretense, projecting the image of a man who did not celebrate victories but recognized the need to correct deep failings. Instead of promising easy solutions, he delivered a public commitment to real change, outlining internal investigations and anti-racist policies for all city schools. The journalists scribbled feverishly, aware they were witnessing not just a political response, but the first step in a collective reckoning. The air felt heavier than ever, thick with the gravity of finally admitting the problem was bigger than any one man. While the headlines splashed the mayor's promises, the school, where it all began, became the stage for forced and necessary changes. The main hallway, once cold and impersonal, was now lined with educational posters about equality and respect, replacing the old honor rolls that fell hollow in the scandal's harsh light. Teachers gathered in training sessions, listening to lectures about structural prejudice with faces drawn tight with discomfort. The interim administration, chosen hastily to replace the ousted principal, adopted a more humble stance, inviting community members to open meetings. Parents who had once been indifferent now arrived with anxious questions, wanting to know how to make sure nothing like this would ever happen again. The weight of collective shame still hung in the air, but was slowly beginning to transform into a cautious desire to change. Students walked the hallways with a new care in their eyes and gestures, watching each other for signs of complicity or resistance. The girl, now back in class, had become a living symbol of the school's failures and, at the same time, of the hope to transform it. Her face carried the burden of memory, but also radiated a quiet determination that this story would not repeat itself. At home, things hadn't gone back to how they used to be, but they had turned into something deeper, marked by a painful honesty. The father no longer hid his weary gaze, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee growing cold in his hands, thinking over every step taken and every consequence still to come. He knew his political popularity had paid a price, but he accepted without regret that he had fulfilled a greater duty. The daughter no longer cowered in silence in the corners of the house. Her braid swung as she hurried off to school, her shoulders straighter, her gaze firm when facing those who once belittled her. At night, there were still heavy conversations between them, remembering what hurt and what would need rebuilding, but also short, sincere laughter that bubbled up almost unexpectedly. Their hugs had become more frequent, less formal, filled with a shared understanding that only those who survived the same trauma could truly share. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was an honest beginning to something new. The home, patched with scars, felt stronger than ever, forged in the certainty that no one there would ever again accept being silenced. The school gate opened on a cold, clear morning, creaking lightly as it allowed the students in, their footsteps echoing on the polished floor. The girl walked in with her backpack firmly on her shoulders, feeling the cold air on her face as a reminder that there was still much to confront. But this time, the eyes on her didn't push her out. They followed her with curiosity, respect, or even shame, recognizing what had changed. The hallways, illuminated with new light, no longer masked the colorful posters preaching equality and empathy. The teachers watched her pass with more careful expressions, choosing their words more thoughtfully, and avoiding empty displays of authority. Some still whispered behind her back, but not with the same cruelty. It was the sound of people being forced to reconsider their own place in that story. When she reached her classroom, she paused for a moment before entering, breathing deeply. Her eyes scanned the desks, the windows, the whiteboard that still bore the marks of old lessons. And then she walked in with firm steps, claiming the space as someone reclaiming a right long denied. It was only the first day of many, but now she knew she would never bow her head again. Tell me in the comments what rating you'd give this story, and I'll see you in the next video that's on the screen.